The text that's going to engage us today is that gospel lesson that Jesus shared with us from John chapter 15, the first 8 verses. Will you join me in word of prayer? O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. My daughters have had already in their schooling to study Shakespeare. And now one of my daughters is in a Christian youth theater class, and she's studying Shakespeare. I don't remember a whole lot. Shakespeare's produced some of the most enduring stories the world has ever known. Romeo and Juliet, or The Haunting Hamlet. But I don't remember a whole lot of Shakespeare. I remember just a couple of lines. Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? It's Juliet bemoaning why she cannot belong to Romeo, why he cannot belong to her because he belongs to the wrong family. Or to be or not to be. That is the question. It's Hamlet trying to decide whether it's good to go on living or if he should just take his own life after finding out that his uncle killed his father, the king. Neither one of those is a question when it comes to the text in John chapter 15 for us today, because Jesus answers those questions about belonging and about the reason for being. Jesus says the answer, obviously, is to be. And Jesus talks about being in him. Jesus said in John chapter 15, verses 4 and 5, abide in me, and I in you. As a branch cannot bear fruit unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine. You are the branches. John chapter 15, verses 4 and the beginning of 5. That statement of Jesus is actually the genesis of our mission statement here at Holy Cross Lutheran Church, which is all about being. It's about what Jesus said being is. B-E, being. And so it's B-E, longing. B-E, leaving. B-E, bearing fruit in Jesus. Or to be less didactic about it. Belonging, believing, bearing fruit in Jesus. That's our mission statement here at Holy Cross. And it's all about this because it's not only in the times of utter despair that the question of being and purpose plagues us like it did for Juliet or Hamlet. But even in the times when life is most fulfilled, we still have those kind of questions. And the comedies and tragedies of someone like Shakespeare aren't going to fill that void. So we need to hear what Jesus says about being. And so we're going to do that today by focusing on these words of John chapter 15. You find them in your service folder. I invite you to follow along where the gospel lesson was printed there for you on page 5. Or if you have your Bible, you can follow along in John chapter 15. We're going to start with the verses I just recited for you. Verse 4 and verse 5. Abide in me, and I in you. As a branch cannot bear fruit unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches, said Jesus. Jesus is talking about our belonging, that we belong in him. The words he uses for that here is the word abide. And abide can be translated in different ways and is translated in different ways in John's gospel. Sometimes it's translated remain, sometimes it's stay, sometimes it's dwell, sometimes it is the word belong. Here he uses the word abide. And this concept is already introduced at the very beginning of John's gospel. If you want to go back to the first chapter, John chapter 1, verses 10 and 11, it's talking about Jesus. It says that he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not know him. He came to his own, but his own people did not receive him. John chapter 1, verses 10 to 11. It's about belonging. Jesus belonged here in this world, and yet he came, and he was treated like he didn't belong. He wasn't received, even by his own people. They saw no place for him. You kind of know what that feels like. I think all of us know what that feels like. To go someplace and to immediately when we get there feel like, I don't belong here. Because no one in the place pays attention to us as we walk in. They're all preoccupied with something else. Or perhaps they do know that we walked in. They might pay attention just long enough to glare at us and then go back to what they were doing before. We immediately feel like we don't belong. That is why I don't have the courage to go to any party where I'm not invited. But even if there's places where we should be welcome, we should be invited, like a local retail store or a restaurant, or worse yet, if it's the home of family or friends, and we should be welcome, and yet we're not received, and we don't belong, that's even more offensive. And that's the way it was for Jesus. Jesus was in the world, and though the world was made through him, it did not know him. Jesus was coming into his own creation. He became part of the humanity that he created, took on flesh and became one with them, and yet there was no place for him. He wasn't received. He was treated like he didn't belong. And then when those disciples come to him later in chapter 1, who would become his disciples, the plot turns on that theme. Because what they ask him in chapter 1, verse 38 is, Rabbi, where are you abiding? Actually, in the ESV translation, it says, where are you staying? But it's the same word as John 15, abide in me. Here it's translated staying. Rabbi, where are you staying? Where are you abiding? And Jesus replied to them and said, come and see. Jesus turns that invitation around. He came into this world and was rejected as if there was no place for him to belong. And yet when somebody came to him, the first thing he did was invite them to belong to him. Come and see. Come abide with me. Come belong to me. And they found their belonging in Jesus. Jesus reminds them of that. The reason I take you to John chapter 1 is because Jesus reminds them of that in this chapter, John 15. Later on in the chapter, after our reading was done, verse 16, Jesus said, you did not choose me, but I chose you. Jesus is reminding them that their belonging with him was his initiative. He chose them to belong to him. And not because they were, in some sense, more special than anybody else, because Jesus chooses all kinds of people who don't belong anywhere else to belong to him. That happens in chapter 8 in John's Gospel as well. Chapter 8 starts out with the story of the Jewish leaders bringing a woman to Jesus. And when they brought her to Jesus, they brought her because they didn't think she belonged. She didn't belong in Israel anymore. She didn't even belong among the living. She was to be stoned. And they brought her to Jesus because they found her committing adultery, and they wanted to know what Jesus would say. And Jesus said to them, let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And then they started to walk away, one by one. And when they had all walked away, Jesus turned to the woman and said, is there no one here that condemns you? And she said, no one, sir. And Jesus said, then neither do I condemn you, but go now and sin no more. Jesus set her free. They brought her because they thought that she didn't belong anywhere, and Jesus set her free. And Jesus will go on in that chapter. That's the beginning of chapter 8. Jesus will go on later in chapter 8, verses 35 and 36, to say that this is the way that all people come to belong in him. They first have to be set free by Jesus. But those same religious leaders who had brought that woman to Jesus told Jesus that we don't need you to set us free because we already belong to God's family. But this is what Jesus said to them. He said, whoever sins is a slave to sin. And the slave has no permanent place in the family, but the son belongs to the family forever. And therefore, if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed. That's John chapter 8, verses 35 and 36. But the interesting part about that is the words that he uses there. That the slave has no permanent place in the family, that the son belongs to the family forever. It's the same words from John 15. It's the word for abide. The slave does not abide in the family, but the son abides in the family forever. It's about belonging. How do we come to abide in this family? Well, first and foremost, the only way we come to abide in this family is that Jesus is the only begotten Son of God who belongs to the family forever. And so if he sets you free and welcomes you into the family, then you're a part of the family, just like he's a part of the family. We belong to the family forever. That's belonging. And so no one has to worry about being rejected in the family. Not when they come to God's family through Jesus. Not rejected on account of their sins or of their life before they come to Jesus. Because Jesus is the one who sets us free from those sins. He was rejected when he came into this world, so that in our coming to him, we would not be rejected. And he was ultimately rejected by those same leaders who wanted to cast that woman out and to put her to death. And he was put to death by them on account of her and her sins. And you and me. me and our sins. He died, and in his resurrection is able to set us free from those sins so that we might belong to him. That's why this is so important. It's the first part of our mission statement at Holy Cross Lutheran Church. Belonging. Belonging. That's the first thing we want people to experience when they enter into this place. Our first questions of people as they come here is not they should prove their place among us by what you believe or by what you've done or you've not done. Our first word to them is simply, in Jesus, you belong. You belong here among us. Because we know that's true for us. That's why we belong here. And that's why others belong here as well. Right after this, John chapter 8 comes John chapter 9. In that chapter, at the very beginning, Jesus and his disciples come across a man who's born blind, who finds his belonging in Jesus when Jesus heals him. But the religious leaders want to cast him out too. They don't want to have anything to do with him. They want to cast him out of the synagogue. And even his own family doesn't want to claim their belonging with him or stand up and defend him because they're afraid they're going to get cast out of the synagogue and they won't have a place to belong. And so after this man who was born blind is healed by Jesus and then is cast out of the synagogue, Jesus finds him later. And Jesus said to him, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he said, who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? Jesus said, he who is talking to you is he. And the man said, Lord, I believe. And he bowed down and worshiped Jesus. Belonging and the word of Jesus that brings belonging engenders faith. Now, there are places in the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, where Jesus will often say something like, your faith has made you well. Or where the text will tell us that Jesus recognized their faith, and on account of their faith, he proceeded to heal them. But in John 15, and in what we're looking at here, and the examples that we've looked at, the flow and the emphasis actually goes the other way. It begins with Jesus' words, and then faith comes from that. So look at John chapter 15, verse 3. Jesus said, you are already clean because of the words I have spoken to you. Jesus' words of choosing, his words of forgiving, his words of healing come first and engender and enliven faith. That's what enables a person to believe. And then they come to faith. But belief and belonging are so closely akin that those blessings of belonging can only be received by those who believe. And those who no longer believe also sever their connection to all the blessings of belonging in Jesus. And that's why in John chapter 15, when Jesus wants to explain this to us, he talks about himself as the vine, and we are the branches. He starts off in John 15, verse 1, saying, I am the vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. And then we get down to John chapter 15, verse 5. He says, I am the vine, you are the branches. And then we get down to verse 6. And he says, if anyone doesn't abide in me, he is like a branch that is thrown away and withers. And the branches are gathered, and they are thrown into the fire and burned. We cannot belong to Jesus without believing in Jesus. But we can also not belong and believe in Jesus only occasionally, sometimes. Our belonging and belief in Jesus can't just be a Sunday morning kind of activity. I spent some time this week cleaning up our yard. It's the time for that. I'm sure you're doing the same kind of thing. It's spring cleaning time. Trimmed a lot of bushes. And those bushes I trimmed, the branches have been sitting for just a few days, but they're already starting to wither. There's no way I could take those branches and try to reconnect them to the stem now. It wouldn't do any good because the branches are lifeless and the stem has already started to heal over in the place where I cut them off. And so no vine dresser would expect that he could somehow take a branch off of the vine and then just a day later or so reattach it again for a little while and then remove it and then reattach it again later and then remove it, expecting the branch would remain healthy if he did that. Well, the same thing is true with us. We cannot just have a periodic connection with Jesus. He is the vine, and we are the branches. And so believing is not just about acknowledging a certain set of principles, that Jesus is the Son of God, Or that Jesus died to save me from my sins. Jesus rose from the grave. Or that his body and blood are truly present in this bread and wine he offers at his supper. It's not just that. Yeah, those things are true. But believing in Jesus as the vine means that I believe that he is the source of my life. And that apart from him, I wither. And that, as Jesus says in John chapter 5, apart from him, we can do nothing. And so that connection we have with Jesus cannot just be a Sunday morning connection, or just a morning devotion, if that's your habit, each day of the week kind of connection. But our connection to Jesus needs to be a constant connection. That his word needs to be flowing regularly in our hearts and in our minds, so that we, on the basis of his word, are reflecting on everything that's happening in our life and the circumstances, so that our eyes are open in those events, just like the blind man, to see God working in our midst in everything that happens during our day. And as his word flows through us in that way, as we're reading it, studying it, and it's just in our minds throughout the day, well, we respond to that word in prayer. That's our response. That's John 15, verse 7. He said, if you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish. We have an open door to conversation with Jesus, because we abide in him. And so this is a place of abiding in Jesus. And so we invite others to come and abide with us, to belong to Jesus and to believe in him as we believe in him. And as we believe in Jesus together, we do gather together once a week in order to encourage one another and grow in that faith and knowledge. As Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 18, continue to grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. We do gather together weekly to grow in that grace and knowledge. And we should miss it if we're not here. Not because we have some obligation to Holy Cross Lutheran Church, but because we belong to Jesus. And because belonging to Jesus, we belong to him along with all the others who belong to him. And believing in Jesus, we believe with all the others who believe in him. And not just those in this local community, but all Christians of all ages. Which is why we share together the creeds in our worship service. Because it's a reminder that we're connected by that confession with all the Christians who have spoken those creeds before us and said, I believe this about Jesus. It's not a set of propositions. It's a life lived in Jesus. Belonging, believing. And that leads to bearing fruit in Jesus. That's why Jesus said in verse 4, as the branch cannot bear fruit apart from the vine, neither can you when you're apart from me. I am the vine and you are the branches. Apart from me, Jesus said, you can do nothing. But he wants us to do something. He wants us to bear fruit. Later on in this chapter, John 15, verse 16, when Jesus said, you did not choose me, I chose you. Jesus finished that statement saying that you may go and bear fruit, and that your fruit may abide. At the end of our reading for today in verse 8, Jesus said, by this the Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove yourselves to be my disciples. God is glorified when we're bearing fruit in his name. You cannot just belong and be a disciple of Jesus, because belonging engenders belief, and belief receives the blessings of belonging. You cannot just believe and be a disciple of Jesus, somehow unattached and unbelonging to anything and just be your own believer. You can't, because believing is for those who belong to the vine and among those who are in Jesus and therefore abide in the vine. But likewise, you can't just belong and believe and be a disciple. All disciples bear fruit. And that's why the vine dresser, the Father, is so busy in verse 2. You see, in verse 1, Jesus says, I am the vine, my Father is the vine dresser. Verse 2, he says, every branch of mine that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes to make it even more fruitful. And we say, well, why would the Father take away a branch that's in Jesus? Well, if the branch is not bearing fruit, then it shows that it neither belongs nor cares to believe in Jesus. But every branch that belongs and believes bears fruit. And yeah, that fruit might start as something very small. I mean, the initial fruit may just be a new willingness to hear and to learn God's word. And so if somebody comes in here for the first time, We expect that fruit is already there. And they're coming to hear and to learn God's word. There's some fruit already showing up. That fruit may be as simple as being willing to sing even in a whisper these words of this hymn and have the courage to do that and not worry about what the person sitting next to me is thinking about my voice. That fruit may be as simple as an unexpected patience toward the slow store clerk in the line that you wouldn't have had before. That fruit may be as simple as some uncharacteristic act of kindness to a stranger that even surprises the person who does it. These are the simple beginnings of bearing fruit in Jesus. But what's the Father doing with that? He's pruning so that we may become even more fruitful. That's what's going on here in this place. This is the place where our Father, the vine dresser, is busy pruning. Pruning with his law and applying the gospel salve of his forgiveness so that we can bear more and more fruit. And even though there's lots of ways here at Holy Cross that you can bear fruit for Jesus, and we talk about this every week with the events that are going on, the opportunities to serve here at Holy Cross, reaching out to refugee communities or serving the children of the community or whatever it is that we're doing, you can be a part of that, bearing fruit in Jesus. But the primary place for our bearing fruit in Jesus is not here. The primary location for our bearing fruit in Jesus is in our daily stations in life. It's in every act of love and joy, every act of peace and patience, every act of kindness and goodness, every act of faithfulness and gentleness, every act that exhibits self-control in our everyday life station, all those fruits of the Spirit. Whenever that shows up as a parent or as an office worker or as a manager or as a businessman or as a neighbor or as a friend, whenever those things show up in our life, that is where God calls us to bear fruit in Jesus. Belonging, believing, bearing fruit in him. That's what it means to be in Jesus. In the story of Hamlet in Shakespeare's play, the reason that Hamlet decides that he should continue to be instead of to not be, the reason he decides not to take his own life, as he says, and it comes early in the play. He says, "Oh, that the everlasting had not fixed his cannons against self-slaughter." In other words, it's the fifth commandment. Because God said in the fifth commandment, you shall not kill, and so Hamlet decides not to kill himself. And yet the law doesn't bear fruit. And so even though Hamlet decides not to kill himself because of the fifth commandment, the irony in the story is, for the rest of the story, he devotes himself and his reason for being to transgressing the fifth commandment in another way, by enacting revenge against his uncle and ultimately trying to kill him. And thereby, Hamlet, in the end, loses his life as well. There's all kinds of reasons why people choose to be instead of to not be in our world. But these are the three which will carry us through to eternal life. Belonging, believing, and bearing fruit in Jesus. In his name.